Welcome to Smith Weekly Discussions, an occasional program for our members of Smith Weekly Research. Please note this program is a private discussion and everything contained herein is for entertainment and educational purposes only. With that, we hope you're in a comfortable position, along with your favorite beverage, to enjoy the discussion. We remind our audience to examine our show notes attached to each of our shows to better understand how our program functions. Before we get into our discussion, we want to say thanks for questions coming from our audience at Smith Weekly, including Gordon S., Jared W., Luke A., and Ryan S. We have a returning guest on the program today, and one we're pleased to have come back. Professor Ian Plimer is back on the show. Ian is Australia's best-known geologist, author, and emeritus professor at the University of Melbourne. Ian has been head of earth sciences and mining geology at universities. Ian has a number of accomplishments, including, well, the list is actually quite long, so I'll just encourage the audience to go look at that in their own time, because it is quite expansive and you can find that on your own. Ian's most recent work, however, has been on the author side and is called The Little Green Book, a series for kids, teenagers, and adults on the topics of energy, climate change, CO2, and life basics. Ian is also the author of Green Murder, a complete masterpiece of 500 plus pages on energy and climate that references over 1,600 sources as part of his research in putting together the book. You can find more about his books via the various online stores like Amazon, and of course, direct from the publisher, Connor Court Publishing. You can check them out as well. Professor Plimer, welcome back to the podcast.
Oh, thank you for having me back again. Obviously, I didn't burn my bridges.
Absolutely not, Ian. You're always welcome here anytime. Love to sit down and have a CO2 filled beverage with you. So hopefully we've got at least a little bit in hand. Well, Ian, as you know, this podcast program has been focused on the natural resource sector. And of course, as part of that, we have to understand things like energy, the underlying impacts on investment due to agendas like climate change, and once again, how that impacts our investment thesis for any specific sector, company, segment of the industry, or a specific commodity. Of course, all of this has financial consequences. So this is why you're returning to the program, so that we can get a continued flavor of your experience and wisdom as we weigh those financial consequences and decisions, among other things, of course, that come up in conversation. And then there's other things we're just concerned about as folks looking at the market. So with that, we have a pile of things to talk about. But before we move into some specific areas of discussion, Ian, we're over halfway through 2024 already. How has the climate change narrative evolved as you've witnessed it and experienced it over the last few years, but also you've been dealing with this for many decades through, of course, former names like global warming. But just in the last few years, Ian, based on your experience, has it been successful for the perpetrators? Is it being more challenged now as people start to do more work? Is the narrative falling apart? Is it gaining ground? What are you seeing out there?
Well, it's been a very successful financial and scientific scam where people have been able to build alternatives to energy and people have been able to fund their scientific research life on grants from governments who feel they have to act to the noise made by the green left. So in that way, it's been very successful. But I think in the West, they're starting to wear out their welcome. The costs of energy have risen exorbitantly high, and the cost of energy drives industry. If you don't have cheap energy, you can't build things, you can't mine, you can't farm, you can't operate in a civilized society where we've spent hundreds of years evolving energy systems that are reliable and cheap. So I think changes are happening, and we're seeing these in Europe, we're seeing them in the US, in my country, Australia. There are slight changes because the proposals put up to have wind and solar driving an industrial economy just don't work. There's no such thing as net zero. It cannot work. Wind and solar don't have the energy density of nuclear or coal or gas or hydro. So that means they have to be subsidised because they're unreliable. That means the costs go up. That means that business runs off to another country where energy is cheap. That means that people are paying huge amounts for their electricity bill And that means that governments partially subsidise the renewable industry. And the only thing renewable about renewable energy are the subsidies. They just keep coming, and they're taxpayers' money. So I think there is a little bit of a change happening right now. I think we have to be poorer and pay more for our electricity before there will be a considerable change.
Interesting points. I appreciate the opening comments on that, Ian. And you bring up a number of things we'll talk about a little bit here in the podcast. Of course, we'll try to keep this at an hour, of course, but there's lots of things we can always expand on. So obviously, you'll have to come back and talk to us more in the future, and we'd love to do that as well. But let me start with your home country. You mentioned Australia. Um, a place that's very dear and near to your heart, and I have a lot of friends in Australia and would like to see some success start to happen on the energy front there. But I've been doing a lot of work for years on energy. You're on the front stage of the debate on energy in Australia. You've done lots of work on the so-called renewables, or excuse me, the ruinables, as you say. And I really like that term, by the way. It's good on you, old chap, for bringing this term to my desk. It's been great to have it available, and it's a very good play on words. My question is in your view, what does quality of energy mean to you? And what would make your list if a nation like Australia wanted to be fully energy independent? Of course, we need to stop on commercial nuclear, splitting the atom, steam power station, however you want to call it. How critical is this quality of energy source in your view?
We need to have variable amounts of energy coming into the grid. At morning time, when everyone puts on their coffee and maybe puts on the television, we have a surge in the requirement for power. So we need to be able to get power very quickly in the morning for that peak load. And that peak load we can do with gas, we can do it with hydro, we can also adjust our coal and nuclear to give us peak load. And then during the day we have a high load, and in the evening when people come in from work, where you again need peak load energy. And so we've got to crank up the energy systems. And at night time, we've still got to have energy because refrigerators run. Supermarkets have refrigerated food, which they have to keep overnight. We have computer systems that are operating 24/7, and large computer systems do consume a lot of energy. So we have to put in a variable amount of energy to the grid at specific times. Now, I need someone to give me the phone number that I can ring up to say, can the wind blow now so that we can cook our breakfast? And then, can the wind blow now so we can have our evening meal? Or can the sun shine today? Get rid of those clouds. Can the sun shine so we can have energy right now? So this is the weakness of the renewable energy, that it isn't energy upon demand. And once you create electricity, you have to use it instantaneously. So you have to have very good statistics and a very good knowledge of demand, and then you provide the supply for this. In my country, Australia, we have thousands of years of coal, good quality steaming coal, good quality black coal, and our coals, like other southern hemisphere coals, are very low in sulphur and are very low in ash. They are prized. We export hundreds of millions of tonnes of coal to Asia. They seem very happy to be able to use our steaming coal for electricity generation. They seem very happy to be able to use our coking coal for making steel. Yet we are having pressure in our own country to reduce the amount of coal that we use. The second energy commodity we have is nuclear. We are the world's third biggest uranium producer. We have thousands of years of uranium in Australia, maybe tens of thousands of years. These are very, very big deposits that we have in Australia. They are huge and they are deep, and we export yellowcake. We have, unlike any other G20 country, we do not have nuclear energy going into the grid. We have one very small 20 megawatt reactor, and this is for medical isotopes, but we don't put nuclear energy into the grid. This is absolutely crazy. We export our yellow cake, so countries in Europe and Asia can use our uranium for energy, for giving out heat, which then drives a steam engine, which then drives turbines, which then drives electricity systems. We also have thousands of years of gas. This is conventional gas from our gas and oil fields, and this is coal seam gas because we have very, very large areas of thick coal seams or intercalated coal seams and sediments, and these provide gas. One well will give you 25 to 30 years of gas, and we have tens of thousands of these wells in Australia. So we are an energy-rich country, yet our current left-wing government is wanting us to be the renewable superpower of the world. We are already an energy superpower with all of our coal, our uranium, and our gas. We don't have much hydro because we're a desert country. We don't have huge mountain ranges like the Andes or the Rockies. We don't have that really high rainfall that many countries that have hydro have. We have fairly high rainfall in northeastern Australia, but again, we don't have the massive rivers that we can dam to give us hydropower. So we've got a few small hydro systems in the country, and they're great in that you can turn them on when you need the demand and turn them off when you don't need the demand. So we are a left-wing country. Left-wing governments in this country have never been able to balance the books. They've never been able to be good economic managers. They've never been good preservers of wealth. They get into debt, and that's exactly what's happening in this country. We have an energy crisis in this country. We've had a fairly cool winter so far, and the energy systems cannot cope. So here we are as a massive energy exporter. We're a G20 country. We don't have any nuclear power, and we have massive electricity hike rises, price rises all the time. Every time we put in more solar and wind, which are destroying good farmlands, then the price of electricity goes up. Somewhere along the line, someone has to say, stop. This is madness. We once had in Victoria, one of the southern states of Australia, energy at 3 cents a kilowatt hour for electricity. It's now 30 cents. So this is what's happened. Victoria used to be the manufacturing hub of Australia. It isn't any longer. We don't have a manufacturing industry there. So the whole concept of human-induced global warming, driven by human emissions of carbon dioxide, has sent this country into an economic tailspin. We're a very wealthy country. We have been able to afford high energy costs, but now it's getting too much. And the last point, and just to underpin this, we have been drinking the Kool-Aid. We have followed the mantra, and we haven't actually asked the key question. Can you please show me that human emissions of carbon dioxide drive global warming? That has never been shown. I've been asking leading climate scientists to give me half a dozen landmark scientific papers that unequivocally demonstrate that human emissions of carbon dioxide drive global warming. It hasn't been done. So this whole mantra in the West has been built on a house of cards. And because the West provides a lot of aid to third world countries, we've been able to force them to go into systems which are sending them bankrupt, systems which are stopping them get out of poverty, and systems where they have to rely on wind and solar when they may well have adequate resources of coal or hydro or nuclear. So the Western world, I think, has kicked an own goal. The Western world has had a very strong left-wing influence for quite a long period of time. And I'm heartened that by the fact that this is changing a little bit in Europe, perhaps in the US, and perhaps in this country.
Ian, lots of stuff there. Thank you for all that. Some very good points, very solid logic and reasonable comments there. I think you have summarized that Australia has everything it needs to be fully energy independent. And the only thing that's left to finish is the infrastructure because you have the natural resources.
There's only one thing we're missing, and that's common sense. We have the infrastructure. We've got some massive coal-fired power stations. And if we are to go nuclear, and that debate is on at present, all you do is put the nuclear power station where the coal station is. You've already got the poles and wires. You've already got the infrastructure. Yet when you put in solar and wind, you've got to put in tens of thousands of kilometres of new grid. You've got to destroy farmland. You've got to put this in well away from the users. And of course, you lose some electricity with a voltage drop when you transport electricity from a long distance into the cities. Now, most of our coal-fired power stations were very strategically located. These were located close to the end user. And so all we need to do is, if we do want to destroy our coal industry and get rid of these coal-fired power stations, then at the site of the coal-fired power station, we put in a big nuclear station. We've already got
Hmm.
the infrastructure. We don't have to waste zillions of dollars, which we're doing at present. So
Yeah.
we are lacking common sense. We're also lacking a press that allows different views to be heard. And it's only programs like yours and many other programs that are not mainstream media where you can actually have a voice. The alternatives just don't get heard. You can't read about it in newspapers. You can't hear it on the radio. You can't see someone with a different view on a popular television program saying, no, this is madness. That just doesn't happen. So we are suffering from a blackout of alternative views. That to me is a very, very dangerous attack on free speech. It's a very dangerous attack on our freedoms.
Oh, absolutely. Well, that's a whole nother conversation here, whether that's intentional or not. And you could put together enough pieces of evidence to suggest that it has been intentional. I completely misspoke in error. My error was I should have said common sense before the small capex to build some reactor fleets to start in Australia, because you're absolutely right. You got to have the common sense and the, how do I say it, the fortitude at the level of government to be able to move forward with this process. It's quite simple to do, as you said, and the infrastructure, as you said as well, 90+% there. We just need the capex for the reactors. So straightforward in my view, Ian. So it's just absolutely crazy. And then of course, the other thing too with the wind and solar stuff, using the analogy of the dial-up, I need to give a call here to see if we can get the wind to blow so I can make my coffee in the morning. It doesn't get much simpler and stupider than that. So I appreciate that. And then of course, back to the renewables. Again, renewables make so much more sense. The renewables, the reality is we've talked about this at length. Renewables really aren't renewable. There's always an impact. I want to pick on even my favorite source of energy that's in the renewable class, and that's hydroelectric. Hydroelectric still has a footprint. It still requires maintenance capital. It's not 100% renewable, and it's my favorite. I love it, but it's not 100% renewable in truth, or in footprint, or in capex. What is truly garbage is wind and solar, unless there is a select couple applications. Ian, let's just imagine for a moment that we live in a cabin in the middle of Alaska. Okay, maybe solar panels at a certain point in the day might work for us, and some good batteries. But that's about the extent, because as you said, you're eliminating so much farmland. The footprints are so massive. The grids, the batteries, everything else that go with it, plus the life cycle turnover, which is what, 10 years at best.
Yes,
So
well, I mean, you've hit the nail on the head. The capex for wind and solar in remote parts of the world are incredibly high. The capex to put in the transmission lines from those remote areas into the end users is very high. And in fact, the capex is higher for wind and solar, especially in Australia, where we have it in very remote areas. It's higher than for nuclear, putting them where they're existing stations, coal-fired power stations. Now, in this country, we're always a little bit wary about hydro because we have droughts, and we not only do we have wind droughts, we have rainfall droughts. We're a desert country, so we've got to be mindful of the fact that sometimes we cannot use hydro in this country. And the third thing is that the OPEX that you have for wind and solar is fairly high because they've got a very short life. You've got to replace them. Whereas with nuclear, you can have 80 or 90 years of life out of a reactor. So on both CapEx and OPEX, wind and solar fail. In terms of the opportunity costs, then the opportunity for nuclear is absolutely fabulous. As soon as you have a huge, long-term, reliable source of energy, you then attract other businesses close to the power stations, and these plug in and use the power. So there are great opportunities that are being missed by having intermittent power, which is renewable, coming from remote areas. And the last thing is that this country is an exporter of food. We export food for about 80 million people. And by covering prime farmland in solar panels and covering prime agricultural land, pastoral land with wind turbines, this actually reduces the amount of food that we put out. And this changes the whole economic structure of Australia. So wind and solar have never been a good idea, except if you're in a very remote part of the country, you might want solar for a phone box in a remote village, or you might want solar for pumps for bore water to bring that up for cattle and sheep to drink. You might have wind, and we have this on a lot of outback ranches. We have wind that provides energy, which then goes into batteries, which is used when we need it. So there is a use for solar and for wind. It's where we don't need huge amounts of power, where we can store the power that's generated in small batteries and use small amounts of power later on. But to run an industrial society on wind and solar is just total madness. There is no country that does this. There is no country that can do it. And there is no country that can reach net zero. So we have been conned.
The applications you say are absolutely, completely logic. When you look at a 100-year life, let's use 100 years as the threshold. 100-year life, okay, what forms of energy, 100-year life? Yeah, coal, gas, you can get there. You can get there with commercial reactors. You're going to have some major overhauls during that period in the case of gas and coal, but you can still do it out of the same facility generally. But when you weigh in a 100-year life of a solar or wind project and you figure in all the battery replacement at current standards, current life cycles of batteries presently, and then all the component wear outs, oh, it doesn't even come close, Ian. It's
No,
got to
no, it
be
doesn't. No.
absolutely ridiculous, fall on off the chair, laughable. And so, yeah, it's really sad. And then the last thing you said, and I want to come back to something you said earlier on a definition basis and get your thoughts on this because I think you'll enjoy it. But you and I are having a conversation over the internet. If the internet only worked, what's the uprate of solar on average? 30, 40%. I think I'm being kind. If the call was like that, where the router connection, we're only getting 30 to 40% of what we're saying, you couldn't even understand. You might as well just delete the podcast and turn it off. But that's what we're talking about. The other thing I was going to ask you, you said climate scientists, you've asked climate scientists who proclaim to be climate scientists about, we'd like to get an answer from you on these certain questions, and they've been unable to produce this information that's been requested. You know, I've come across, Ian, a lot of new titles out there. As you can imagine, there's a lot of new titles and a lot of neutrality in the places like the United States with respect to titles, which is, it's just a title, so it's a little bit funny in itself. But anyway, what is climate scientist to you, Ian? Because when I was at university, and I think you can say the same, this was not on the majors or minors list.
No, there's no such science. It's mechanisms of gouging money out of governments in research grants. There is no discipline called climate science. There were meteorologists, there were atmospheric physicists, and there were some life scientists and some chemists who've now relabeled themselves as climate scientists. But if you want the ultimate climate science, then go to my field, and that is geology. For 200 years in the textbooks, we have had deep and meaningful discussions about climate, especially in the Northern Hemisphere, when much of the Northern Hemisphere is covered by glacial debris from the last glaciation. And so there had been great discussions about these huge boulders that were left covering parts of Europe. In the Scandinavia, there was one view that this was from a great fight between trolls, and the boulders are those which they threw at each other. Another view was a religious view, a creationist view, that this was debris left behind by the Great Flood, Noah's flood. And yet there was another view that took some time to gain traction, and that was this was the debris left behind from retreating ice. And people started to dawn on climate science in the mid-18th century when in the Paris Basin there were tropical fossils of plants, there were tropical animals fossilized, and people realized, oh, wait a minute, the climate has changed. They were very, very close to understanding a concept of continental drift, but again, in the English almost got onto continental drift in the 1830s, and it was the Germans with Wegener in the just at the beginning of the 20th century who then really cemented the idea of continental drift, although he was pilloried and it didn't come around to being the all-embracing theory until the 1960s and 70s. So we geologists have been battling with climate for a long while, and this is because people found fossils, and these fossils were marine fossils. Well, you obviously once were underwater. These fossils were tropical species. Well, you obviously were once tropical. And so we've had people then going out and counting the number of species. And a concept arose where if you have a very large number of species, you're in a warmer climate. And if you have a very small number of species, you're in a cold climate. Now, that is correct. We find that today. But in the mid 1700s, that idea came to the forefront. So the ultimate climate scientists are those that look at the history of the planet written in stone. And as geologists, we see climate cycles. And these climate cycles you can see in outcrops. These climate cycles are tectonic. They are galactic cycles. They are orbital cycles. They are lunar tidal cycles. They are solar cycles. And more recently, there's been a 2.4 million year cycle discovered, which is related to Mars. So we have been looking, we geologists have been looking at climate for a long period of time, because as soon as you go to an outcrop, you try to work out what were the conditions that existed at the time when this material was deposited. Was it tropical? What latitude were you at? Was it marine? Was it continental? Was it freshwater? They're the questions we always ask. So in my view, the only discipline that you could call climate science would be geology. And those people who today call themselves climate scientists are basically chasing research money. And if you had a government say, we want to have a massive research project, which we will fund to show that humans do not drive climate change, then you would find the same people would be queuing up with their hand out for research monies. These people are eminently unemployable. They can only be employed in institutes that get government funding, in other words, taxpayer funding, and they are there to scare us so they can keep drinking their wine and eating caviar.
Ian, thank you for that. So basically, nothing short of ambulance chasers or paycheck
That's
chasers,
right, they're
if you will.
freeloaders. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. No, and if it's structured that way, then I can see the absolute intent and rush into that, because it's basically handouts. So I catch that. And so therefore, with that structure of follow the money, you can pretty much draw some pretty quick conclusions as to why this is happening. And it's funny, you mentioned when it was written in stone, you talked about Earth history written in stone. Well, literally, as a geologist, it absolutely is. And even if you're not a geologist, it absolutely is written in stone, because it's measurable, it's there, it's identifiable. All you have to do is test your theories and come up with conclusions based on data. Pretty straightforward. But I think my title, Ian, because I can assign titles to myself all day. Sometimes, as you know, there's folks that identify as chickens today and rabbits tomorrow, and maybe pigs or dogs or horses the next day. So pick your day of the week. But in this case, I think I'll take my new title. It'll be climate janitor. I think would be a suiting
Yes,
title.
yes.
Okay, one thing on energy, and then I want to move on. We have the solution in front of us, and it's fission. We have a solution that's proven. It's fission, and that should be really the backbone of all energy systems. Do you think we need fusion, Ian, at this point? Or maybe we should employ it once it gets harnessed and commercialized and rolled out in due course? Any thoughts on fusion?
Well, nuclear fusion has always been 10 years away. And in my life, it's been 10 years away for many, many decades. We again are told the propaganda that this is going to be cheap and it's going to go forever, and on we go. Um, I take your point. We do have so much uranium and thorium on planet Earth that's easily mineable, easily accessible, that maybe we don't need nuclear fusion at all. There are other sources of energy also that are atomic sources, such as the breakdown of cobalt 60, that then can be harnessed to produce electrons. We can use those for various spacecraft to give us long life energy where we might be a long distance from the sun and can't use solar power. So it's not quite a nuclear reactor, it's an atomic reactor. So there are other sources which people are exploring. Geothermal is very restricted as to where you can have geothermal, and in many cases, geothermal. There have been a lot of residential complaints about the noise, about the H2S and the SO2 that's emitted from geothermal systems, and they clog up with the precipitation of minerals coming out of the steam and clogging up all the piping. And there's been a lot of work on geothermal, but unless you're basically living in a volcanic terrain, you can forget geothermal. And there's another system that's been looked at, and that's hot, dry rock. There are some rocks that are enriched in uranium, thorium, and potassium. These give out heat. These quite often are at great depth. So you can drill a sequence of holes into these rocks. You can frack the rocks and pass water into one hole, and it comes out another hole as steam, which you can use to drive a turbine. Now, that's been tried in parts of Australia, parts of Cornwall, parts of Central Europe, parts of the US. Hot, dry rock geothermal energy has a couple of problems. One, it's very, very expensive to drill those holes. Secondly, the OPEX is very high because you have to continue to scale them. And thirdly, there are chemical reactions that take place in the rocks that change the porosity and permeability very quickly. So you've sunk all this capital and all of a sudden you can't create energy from it. So I think it's healthy to be looking at all other forms of energy, be it nuclear fusion or be it hot, dry rock or be it other isotopes decaying. But at this stage, the cheapest form of energy for people on planet Earth is coal. The second cheapest is nuclear. Then after that, we have gas, which is also quite cheap in some areas. So I can't see why we should ignore hundreds of years of development of energy systems to get cheap and reliable energy systems where we've already sunk the capital, where the OPEX is fairly low, and where we then abandon them to go for ideological electricity. Now, the ideological electricity is not put up by scientists or engineers, it's put up by the political left.
If only things were run, Ian, as a profit-seeking, cash-flowing, operating business, you would get so much more done, wouldn't you?
Yes, and run by engineers and scientists, not by ideologues sitting in their ivory tower in a university somewhere, or sitting in Washington or London or Paris or Berlin or Canberra in Australia, run by people who actually know things. You don't have to know anything now to be a political hatchet man. All you've got to do is to follow the party line
Yeah.
and bully people and maybe tell lies, maybe withhold the truth.
Yeah. Even things like trash pickup outside your house and how that works is forgotten and not understood by the very same people who are
Yes,
trying to make
yes,
rules.
yes.
I want to come back into the CO2 bit and get into that in a moment here. But one of the things, Ian, that's come up as well is that a lot of folks have been led to believe, and I do believe this is completely incorrect, that there's an increase beyond even historic or even past records of things like wildfire, drought, floods, hurricanes. I'd like to have you just make a few comments about this in terms of if it is true that the frequency of these things are occurring, keyword naturally, um, maybe with a few specifics if you want, and just your overall comment as to if this is valid or misrepresented.
We have a great movement out there that's trying to frighten us, but we also have an attack on the education system, and that's been happening for 50 years. So, what happens now is that people don't have references and sources to look back in time. They immediately go to Wikipedia or immediately go to social media and get an instant answer, which is an edited answer and may well not be correct. So we can go back in time and look at the frequency of wildfires. We can look at it. We've got very good figures in the US. We've got very good figures for the globe. And the frequency of wildfires has actually decreased. Now, why is that so? Because we have better firefighting techniques. We can bomb these from helicopters and aeroplanes. We don't have as many people living in the backwoods in a wooden hut, which will burn down. We have much better architecture. We have much better firefighting systems. We're much more aware of wildfires. We also have very good statistics, especially in the US, of hurricanes. And the number of hurricanes has fallen on the land, the number of residences that have been wiped out by hurricanes, the number of people that have been killed by hurricanes. And we see exactly the same trend. And these figures are out there for all to see. There's been a decrease in the amount of hurricane activity in the US, a decrease in the number of fatalities, and we've also had an increase in costs. And the reason for the increase in costs are we're getting wealthier. We build houses on the waterfront, and these are the first to get affected by a hurricane. Now, we had higher fatalities in the past because people didn't live in well-constructed buildings. A lot of these were wooden. A lot of these were buildings that could be very quickly demolished if the eye of the hurricane went through them. We also have a long-term record of temperature. And since we've been measuring temperature with a thermometer, we've had 3 rises in temperature. We've had 2 falls and 1 period of time of stasis where nothing happened. Those records are very well kept records from 1850. These records have been adjusted, but they still show those trends, and these have been adjusted for nefarious reasons. They've been adjusted for a good reason, like the urban heat island effect. So we don't see an increase in temperature. We actually see cyclical temperatures. In terms of rainfall and drought, again, we see the same. In the 1930s in the US, we have the Dust Bowls. We have big rains around the Pacific area where we are with the El Nino La Nina cycle. These are well documented and they go back hundreds of years. We can correlate these cycles in Australia with where we've had a big El Nino rains. Everything grows, our forests grow, we have a huge amount of undergrowth in these forests, and a couple of years later we get massive forest fires. This is because we haven't burnt off the undergrowth in a sequence of small fires and haven't cleared off the undergrowth, and so we have a very good correlation between heavy rains and massive forest fires. So if you look back in time, and if you've been trained to value history, and if you've been trained to look at records, then you can see that we do not live in extraordinary times. There is no climate crisis. What we have is a crisis of common sense. But we do have a carbon dioxide crisis. When multicellular life first appeared on the Earth, we had the atmospheric carbon dioxide content was about 500 times its current value. And we've been sequestering that carbon dioxide into shells, into limestones, into limey rocks, into coal and into oil. And when we burn those, of course, we later put that carbon dioxide back in the atmosphere. So if we burn limestone to make cement, the carbon dioxide goes into the atmosphere. If we burn coal or oil, the carbon dioxide goes back to where it is. But we've gone down from 0.7% carbon dioxide, 0.7% carbon dioxide in the atmosphere to 0.04%. We are in a carbon dioxide crisis. That has happened in the last 10% of geological time, where we've gone down from 0.7% to 0.04%. If it keeps going down and we halve it, then plant life will die. And once plants die, all the animals die. So yes, we do have a carbon dioxide crisis. There is not enough plant food in the atmosphere. And we've had thriving vegetation and thriving animal communities when we've had far more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere than now. So what's the problem? It's easy to demonize something that you can't see, you can't smell, you can't taste, you can't touch. This has been done with radioactivity. We've done the same with carbon dioxide. So we live in a society now where we have a huge number of BS jobs. These BS jobs push out BS into the community, and the end result is that we make very, very bad decisions about energy, coal, oil, and all the resultant products like plastics and fertilizers. And if we don't have fossil fuels, then we have real problems with steel, with plastics, with fertilizers, and with cement. And these are the foundations of modern society.
And of course, we all use them. So whether you're pro or not, we're all using them, whether you're using a highway with asphalt or you're using a mouse pad or a mouse or a keyboard or a plastic case
Or
for going
painting
to
a
the airport.
sign at the demonstration saying you stop coal, stop oil. Uh, you've got there using fossil fuels, and you're using paints which are fossil fuel based. So the
Yes.
ignorance and the hypocrisy is just breathtaking.
Yeah, it's absolutely a crisis of sense and logic. When you look at that too, when you have the success that we've had, many nations have had over this period, and that success has come from fossil fuels, Ian. That's a primary building
Yes,
block
well, look
to that
at
success.
look at Europe, look at the US, look at the UK. They all developed on fossil fuels, and the best example would be looking at how we lit our residences in past times. In past times, we used whale oil lanterns. And then by using kerosene, which was mineral oil, we saved the whales. It's the fossil fuel industry that saved the whales. It wasn't demonstrators. If we look at the glass making and steel making in Europe, they clear felled forests to make charcoal to be able to make glass or to be able to make steel. And once it was realised that coal is energy dense and it's a chemical reductant, and we could then use that to make glass and to make iron, which then we could make in steel by using more coal. And the forests of Europe grew back. The forests of Europe are not virgin forests, they've been clear felled a couple of times. So it was the use of coal that saved the forests and allowed the forests to rebuild. If you look at the motor vehicle, years ago in places like Pittsburgh or Chicago, we had horse poo, horse shit that was right through the streets. And this was washed into the wells. People would use that drinking water. And when the motor car came along, there were fewer horses shitting in the streets. It became cleaner. And so we saved lives and we reduced the amount of pollution by using the motor car. So we see examples from the past where technological development has actually been great for environmental change. And we see that globally now. If you want to reduce environmental damage, then you need to be a wealthy country. So the greatest thing we in the West can do is to have those in third world countries become wealthy. Because when they're wealthy, there is less environmental damage and there are fewer children. And so your complete environmental footprint changes. So in my view, we have this completely and absolutely around the wrong way, and that's because we don't read history.
Yes. Very few folks actually read these days, as you know, Ian.
Well, very
So
few can read, let alone cursive writing.
let's not even bother with the cutting of trees and biomass and the burying of trees. Let's not even get into that one. But when you look at this, back to my point here was that these have elevated a certain standard of living that then, Ian, created a platform to allow that person to go and protest these things,
You
to
are
go
absolutely
and
correct.
enjoy
Correct.
that wealth that those generations have created. So this success in itself has now created a platform to where you basically have now dis-success and you have everybody completely upside down in the thinking, which, as you well know, you and I can both agree on this, that there is a cycle to this. This will conclude. It will conclude. There's no doubt about it. And when that happens, obviously, is the question mark at this time, but we're certainly seeing that start to occur. And as you said, people eventually, when the price gets too high, and when things get bad enough, people will say enough. That's where it goes. And so that's an interesting piece. And I want to ask you this, that you touched, again, we talked CO2 here a couple times. We know that that is the gas of life. It's a trace gas in the atmosphere, Ian, as you know. It makes up a very small percentage of the gases in the atmosphere. Yet there's a war on CO2. But what about the other gases, including the pollutant gases? Why have they been left out of this conversation, Ian, and why have they been left out of this war?
The strongest greenhouse gas in the atmosphere is water vapour. It's far more abundant than carbon dioxide, and its effect on keeping the planet warm is far greater than carbon dioxide. But it's very hard to mount a political campaign against water or water vapour. The gas of life is actually a measure of industrial development. So this is a deindustrialization attack. And by having industry, there are other gases, nitrogen gases, that go into the atmosphere. There are also other natural gases like methane. And most of the world's emissions of methane come from the tundra. We get natural leakage of emissions of methane coming out of the rocks. Beneath that, we may well have petroleum, or we might have coal, or we might just have fossiliferous material. But the bulk of the world's emissions of methane are natural. We have huge emissions of methane from termites. In northern Australia, we have a massive emission of methane from termites, yet we have an attack on cattle. And this is an ideological argument brought up by the vegans and vegetarians that we should reduce the cattle emissions of methane and carbon dioxide. And in Ireland, there is an EU proposal to cull 200,000 head of cattle. This has got nothing to do with the climate. This has got nothing to do with the environment. This is an unelected minority trying to enforce their dietary choices on everyone. And we just got to say no. So the atmosphere, like the rocks, like the oceans, and like life, evolves. And we've had three atmospheres on planet Earth. The first one was a very primitive and hot atmosphere, and that was rich in things like ammonia and hydrogen and helium, all of which chemically changed, and some of them escaped the planet. The second atmosphere, which we've had for the bulk of time, was an atmosphere that was rich in carbon dioxide. The third atmosphere, which is our current atmosphere, is an atmosphere that's rich in oxygen, which we use. 21% of it is oxygen, which we use for combustion and for breathing. We may well be, in geological time, evolving to our fourth atmosphere, and this is an atmosphere with almost no carbon dioxide, because it would have been naturally sequestered into soils and sediments and life. And that will be a nitrogen dominant atmosphere with no carbon dioxide, and as a result, very little oxygen. So I think we have to realise that everything is changing. We are living on a planet that has constant change. And so to try to preserve something or conserve something at one moment in time is actually going against what nature is doing, and that is changing. So you cannot conserve a dynamic environment. And we're being told to conserve this. So our atmosphere has had a lot of rubbish put into it during the early stages of industrial development. And when we got wealthy enough, we were able to clean up our emissions into the atmosphere of particulates, of hydrocarbons, of complex chemicals. But you can only do that when you're wealthy. You've only got to see the pall of pollution in countries like China to see that they have a lot to do. But we've done that in the West. We've pretty well done it. We've cleaned up our waterways, which we made very dirty. We've cleaned up the atmosphere, which we made dirty. We're not throwing plastics into the ocean. They're the four big rivers in Africa and Asia that are putting plastics into the ocean. We're doing our bit, and we can only do our bit because we're wealthy.
Ian, a couple of follow-ups there. So if I live in a city and 30 million people in this city, on certain days it's more obvious than others depending on the winds and various other circumstances, but that overlying smog and haze that you see in a city skyline, where's the CO2 there?
There is CO2 there because you've got a circulating atmosphere. Those smogs you get, very commonly an inversion in the atmosphere, and you get that more commonly in developing countries than you do in industrial Western countries. So that's quite a common phenomenon. And We have some very, very good statistics on respiratory health and smog, and it's clearly not good for you. It clearly kills people, and we've seen that in parts of the US where they have been cleaned up over time. Parts of Europe, for example, the Ruhr used to be absolutely filthy. It's quite a clean area now. The great industrial areas of northern England were filthy. They've been cleaned up. The incidence of these inversion smogs has gone down enormously in wealthy Western countries. And that's because there was a recognition that this was killing people. Carbon dioxide does not kill people. And if I'm wrong, perish the thought, but if I'm wrong, and that human emissions of carbon dioxide are warming the planet, that's fabulous because more people die in cold weather than in warm weather. We see greater species diversification in warmer climates than we do in colder climates. So we humans are creatures from the Rift Valley of Africa, creatures where it was warm and wet. We have evolved to be able to survive on the edge of ice sheets and in some cases on the ice sheets. We've evolved to be at sea level, to be in the top of the Alps, to be in deserts, to be in tropical and temperate areas. We are a remarkable species and we can adapt. And our catastrophists don't seem to realise that humans do adapt. We live in all sorts of environments at present. I have a friend, he's just sent me an SMS, but I won't answer it until I'm off the air. He's working in Saudi, and it's summertime in Saudi. It's 55 degrees Celsius. People can live in these sort of temperatures. The average global temperature is less than a third of that figure. So we have adapted. We're a remarkable problem solving, oxygen breathing, carbon dioxide emitting organism. We are absolutely remarkable. We can solve problems. But the ideology we're getting faced with is, oh, there's a problem. We cannot solve it. We must stop doing everything. No, that's completely against what we have achieved as humans, especially over the last couple of 100 years.
Ian, so CO2 obviously is not part of city pollution, which is
No,
what
it isn't.
people
No,
have been.
no,
Yeah. So I just wanted to make sure that point was made clear to the
no,
audience.
it's not pollution. To relabel the gas of life as pollution is quite evil. And
Yes.
years ago, the first thing kids would learn at school would be about photosynthesis. In other words, the conversion of carbon dioxide and water and using sunlight into sugars and cellulose in plants. Now, the first thing they learn at school is that this is a dreadful climate changing pollutant and we have to stop emitting it. So we've
So
changed the narrative.
so the grass eaters, whether we have cattle or, well, a lot of people eat grass too, as you well know now, Ian. Goats, sheep, they're not needed apparently, is some of the thinking out
Well,
there.
you can do the mass balance calculations. Let's say you've got a certain tonnage of grass. That grass has got its carbon from the atmosphere. It used carbon dioxide as plant food and it's put it into the grass as complex carbon compounds. Now, along comes a wonderful piece of proto beef, and that eats the grass and it converts the grass into meat, into hide, into hairs, into carbon dioxide, into methane. And so that beast emits methane, which quickly oxidizes in the atmosphere to carbon dioxide. That carbon in the methane came from the grass, and the carbon in the grass came from the atmosphere. So all you're doing is putting the carbon back in the atmosphere. But this is a net loss process. It's a sequestration process because that beast will shit carbon bearing compounds and that will stay in the soil and end up as fertilizer in the soil. So we're removing carbon that originally came from the grass and putting that on the soil. We're also removing carbon when we slaughter the beast, when we eat the meat, and when we use the hide for leather. And we're putting that carbon compound in the skin into leather, and that carbon compound came from the grass, which came from the atmosphere. And that leather we pulled out of the system and we use it for decades. And so the very fact that you have cattle grazing, farting and belching carbon dioxide and methane is a net loss process. We are actually doing the planet a lot of good by having cattle grazing and by eating beef. Now, we know that because in the US, you had bison, and the US now has about 60 million cattle. And in the US, there were probably double that number of bison that had been slaughtered. Now, if these animals emitted methane, which warmed the planet, then we should have seen a change in the climate by removing all those bison from the ecosystem because they're no longer emitting methane. We should have seen a change in the climate. These critters should have made a difference. We don't. So we're being fed a complete, absolute story of scientific illiteracy about the role of agriculture and the cycle of methane and the cycle of carbon dioxide. So methane is a trace gas in the atmosphere. You have a good volcanic burp, you will get carbon dioxide, a little bit of methane into the atmosphere. You have a good burp in the tundra, and you will put methane into the atmosphere, and that will quickly oxidize and go to water vapor and carbon dioxide. So it's fairly fundamental when you do a mass balance calculation. This is a bit like balancing the books in a financial statement, that what goes in comes out. So I think, again, we're being fed propaganda by those people who want to change your life, but don't have to face an electorate to put in those changes.
Well, I don't know that they want to change your life. I think more like control would be what they want,
Well, yeah,
not
very much
necessarily
control.
change.
Yeah, and have your
And
hand, have their hand on your purse all the time.
for sure, no, we'll save it for another time. But what's interesting here is so you have to apply that to all animals, and we're animals too, by definition. So, okay, you've got X amount of cows, you've got X amount of pigs and chickens and goats and sheep and all the wildlife out there, deer and elk, bison, horses.
Termites. You got to
So
wipe out. We've got to have a genocide program against termites.
the
They're the
war on
biggest
termites.
animal emitter of methane.
The war on termites. I like it. But you have also 8 billion people, and all these 8 billion people, Ian, last I checked, I mean, even today, probably had a few burps. I've had a few farts. I've had to go to the restroom a few times. How do we play in this? Because if you count 8 billion people, or do we even compare it to the cattle population?
Well, 8 billion people is not many in terms of an ecosystem. The biggest biological mass on planet Earth are not the trees, it's not the whales, it's not people, it's actually bacteria. And the bulk of the biomass on planet Earth are bacteria. And the bulk of those bacteria live beneath your feet in the top 5 kilometres of the crust. It's bacteria that actually drive systems. For example, we have these bacteria in the oceans, and these bacteria will um, use carbon dioxide as plant food, and they will emit oxygen. The Amazon is not the lungs of the planet giving out the oxygen we all breathe. It is bacteria. It's green slime of the lungs of the planet. So we get it all wrong. We look at animals that we can see. We can't see bacteria, but in terms of biomass and in terms of the effect that they have on the atmosphere is absolutely enormous. The effect they have in the soil is enormous. We are a creeping colony of critters. We have a huge amount of bacteria in our body. 90% of our cells are bacteria. 15% of our body weight is bacteria. We are a creeping colony of critters. So if you really want to do something and try to twiddle the dials and change the planet, then you should have a war on bacteria. So the reason why we have a war on humans is very simple, that we humans have got residual Christianity where we have concepts of guilt and repentance and indulgences. And this is what this new religious movement is doing. It's relying on this residual Christian thinking to actually try to change the way we operate on planet Earth. But that's going to do nothing. We humans are a very, very insignificant organism on planet Earth. If you really want to have an attack on whatever system you want for whatever harebrained, crazy reason, then you can attack bacteria. And a lot of the people putting up these ideas, I think, on climate change are half-wits. But the real problem is that we're still looking for the half.
There's so many things, Ian, we don't know. I don't have the exact number in front of me from one of these studies, but the amount of unknown species and unknown bacteria and protozoals and fungals and all these different things, there's so much unknown about that, let alone so much unknown about the natural cycles of weather and all the things that we have that make up what we have here on Earth. And it can't even begin to be comprehended. And we're so far down the path and we still don't fully understand it. Yet we want to tamper with it. We have this, but some people have this wanting to tamper with things that they can't control. Really can be quite destructive. And I'll just say some things just should not be messed with. Leave it alone. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. And
Well,
so,
I agree. I agree.
yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
when one of the thrills I've had in science is the unknown. Now, people get frightened by the unknown. I don't. I get excited by the unknown. You're absolutely correct. There's so much we don't know. This is why models don't work. There is so much more to learn, and to tamper with a system when you might only know 5 or 10% of that system, to me, is terribly dangerous. And people
Mm.
talking about changing the climate and reflecting light and heat from space so that we cool down, I think they're terribly, terribly dangerous concepts. It's all right to speculate, but don't take it any further than that. And science is married to evidence. We get evidence and we think about it and we come up with an explanation. But when we get more evidence, we will change that explanation. So science is constantly changing and moving because of what we don't know. And there is a thrill in not knowing how things work. And the challenge is find out how it works and then get on to the next problem.
As you said, there's so many things we don't know, yet somehow, magically, how could it be in the scientific community there's ever consensus on anything, anywhere in science whatsoever, for the most part, unless it's something that's obviously put to rest completely with real data and it's been solved and finished. It's absolutely crazy to me that this is even in front of us today. And obviously, it's just a case of follow the money once again. But I want to come back to something you said earlier. We talked a little bit about wildfire and natural disasters and these types of things, which have always been with us, of course. In your review of the narrative, do you think that the narrative has also been in part perpetrated by utilization, and this is of course in part, but by utilization of weather manipulation, intentional acts like arson, infrastructure sabotage, killing of crops, and these things? Ian, what's your thoughts on this as a vehicle to also help tell a story?
Well, I think some of it is deliberate, not all of it. I think some of it is accidental, but when in doubt, always go for chaos and people stuffing things up completely. So there is an element there, I think, of deliberate destruction of what people don't agree with. And the best I saw of this was in Greece. I've spent many years working in Greece, and real estate developers would start a massive forest fire in the pine forests, destroy everything, such that the land was prepared for putting on building a residential complex. Now that's very, very cheap and nasty self-interest. But I think there is quite a trend of people wanting to destroy as a mechanism of pushing forward their ideology.
We've seen enough examples of this to show that even on other topics and other cases, we've seen intentional acts to help drive a narrative towards a certain outcome. And let me just couple this with one other piece here that I think is important and would love your opinion on this is, can we be true stewards of environment while also maintaining and improving a standard of living, and then also maintaining all aspects of freedom?
I think we can. I think we demonstrated in the past that we could, and I think we're destroying that now. But I think we can, because unless you have freedom, there's no way of using knowledge to understand where we are and what we're doing. You need freedom. So, by this destruction of freedom, you end up going down the path that we've seen in other despotic political regimes. In 1977, I spent 6 months in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, and there was no freedom. Here was the great proletariat getting destroyed by pollution. The countries were absolutely filthy. The pollution coming out of the coal mines, coming out of the um, heat generating systems coming out of the power stations. I'd never seen anything like it. The occupational health and safety was just terrible. You would have explosions underground where hundreds of people were killed. So the left has always been pushing freedom very hard. Then when you go to the ultimate end product of these left systems, you see that there are no freedoms, that there's no environmental caring, that there's no concern about the human state. So I think that's where the left is pushing us at present, going back to systems whereby we have no freedoms, where the pollution is incredible. And you've only got to look at wind turbines and solar factories to see the amount of environmental damage and pollution that these create. We have gone backwards with these. And in 200 years' time, people will say, well, what on earth were they thinking? My answer is they weren't thinking. But I think once you take away freedoms, you go back to those totalitarian systems where people suffer, the environment suffers, the economy suffers, and basically become a worker bee in a huge hive.
No, I think that's absolutely well said, Ian. And back to what you said about the solar panels, maybe we should just attach some gutters to those solar panels, Ian, so when it rains, we collect the water, and then who wants to drink the water?
Yeah, that's
Oh,
right.
a couple other things here before we wrap up and close up, and I appreciate the time here. It's always great to talk. You've been criticized by a number of people out there. You've been, of course, fact checked, as they say, by people that have a fraction, Ian, if even that, I think I'm being kind, of your experience and expertise. You've been canceled, you've been flagged, whatever you want to call it. And I know this is a little bit open ended, but maybe tell us a little bit about what areas that you have frequently been criticized for. And if you have the time, where those people have been generally led astray, besides, of course, the paycheck.
Well, I get criticised a lot, but I'm very much aware that bomber pilots understand that when the flak increases, you're close to the target. So um, I really don't care about criticism because I only use facts. And if you speak the truth and use facts, you don't have to remember what you said. Now, for people to try to fact check me, all I can say is best of luck because my comments are underpinned by knowledge, underpinned by life experience. The way in which I am treated is that I don't get a hearing in the mainstream media. I get a lot of hearings on other things like your shows and various television programs and Fox and Sky and things like this, but the mainstream media just gives me no voice. I get no voice in newspapers. They, as soon as I write something, it either gets thrown out or they have lawyers look at it and they get frightened that I've said things that are correct, but the lawyers have a lot of problem in understanding science. So I'm banned from mainstream media. I've also, on a number of occasions, been banned from giving lectures in universities, where I'm using my geological knowledge to look at past climates, and that view cannot be accommodated by the atmospheric physicists, and so they rally around and ban me from talking in public. And that doesn't go unnoticed by those people who actually do listen to me. So I think that comes with the territory. I think being criticised, I think being banned, I think being attacked comes with the territory. But what can you do? You can either fight using facts and figures, or you can lie down and wet the bed. There's no alternative. So you have to fight. And even though we live in advanced, wealthy Western countries, there's still a lot wrong with them. And you need to constantly trim the sails, correct the course that we're going on, because in many cases we are taking the wrong course. And when in doubt, just look at self interest and follow the money. Why do people criticise me? Because their Institute of Climate may well have questions asked. Why should we be funding this place when we've got a few others just like it? Why should we be listening to these people when we've got plenty others to listen to? So I'm dangerous because I'm bad for business.
Well said, and I like the analogy at the front end. That was great. Thank you for that. Very good comments there. I appreciate that and how you're looking at this and the fact that, again, you're going to continue your work. And it's a similar thinking here. At the end of the day, say what you want. It really doesn't hold any weight. until you have something that has some sound logic behind it.
Yeah, and evidence. Yeah.
Absolutely. So, Ian, for the commoner, though, I want to help something. I want you to maybe give the audience a bit of a shot here and help them out a little bit here. But for the commoner who just hasn't had the time to spend on a deep dive of climate and energy, because of course they're trying to provide for their families, can you give us just a concise set of statements or points that sum up and deliver the main facts about climate change so at least that they are equipped with a basis to do their own work, as well as to have conversations about this topic when talking with others, because of course it comes up in conversation?
Well, I'll answer this in two parts. The first is if someone says we're in a climate catastrophe, then you say, oh, that's interesting. Show me. If they then decide to quote a government official or the IPCC or a climate institute, then the next question is, well, do you have the knowledge to be able to understand what they're saying to you? Or are they feeding you propaganda? So I've found in discussions, and they're very rare because very few people want to discuss this with me, that you put the onus on the other person, get the other person to justify their position. Don't try to justify your position. But if you have to justify your position, just look back in the past and look at the cycles of climate, where we've had much, much hotter and drier conditions than now, such as in the Midwest, in the US in the 30s, such as periods where we've had very, very heavy rainfall in my part of the world in the mid 50s due to El Nino, La Nina cycle. In the 73, 74, 75, we had the same. Look back at history, and if someone says, oh, this is the hottest day we've had ever, show me. Surely it was hotter in the 30s. Surely it was hotter in the medieval times. Then start looking at history and say, well, why is it that it was warmer in medieval and Roman times and cooler in Viking and Middle Ages times? Why was it warmer at one time than now and cooler at other times? Surely these were natural cycles then. So why is it that we're not in a natural cycle now? And can you show me that the human effects dominate the natural cycle, which has never been done, of course? So I've found that the way to handle this is to ask questions. Can you show me that the climate cycles that we've established based on the position of the continents, based on supernoval eruptions, based on the orbit of the Earth, based on solar cycles, based on lunar cycles, based on Martian cycles. Show me that they're wrong. Show me that these don't drive climate. Show me that a trace gas in the atmosphere actually can drive a whole planetary system. Show me that why that we have 0.04% carbon dioxide in the atmosphere now, yet at times when we had 20%, we didn't have runaway global warming. We actually had the two biggest ice ages this planet has ever seen. So put the onus on the other person all the time. I don't have to justify my position as being skeptical because almost everything we get fed in today's world is absolute BS. I don't have to justify being skeptical. Being skeptical is a natural human quality. But you have to justify why you can make an extraordinary statement and show me the evidence. And if the evidence is convincing, I will change my view. So I think the best way to argue against those people who want to tell you the end of the world is coming, that you have to change your ways, that we're facing a climate catastrophe, is put the onus on them. You're making the claim, you show me the evidence.
Well said. I hope that helped out with some of the folks who are engaged in those and have those times come up in conversation, casual conversation, where this could be discussed. Ian, one other thing there, just for the audience, besides what you just said, how best can they get involved in their local efforts, local community? What can they do to help get the word out about this nonsense and really bring healthy debate and logic back to the table?
Get involved. Write letters to your local newspaper. Write to your local politician. Post stuff on as many sites as you can. Make sure you get it right, but get involved. You can't sit back and say, oh, my electricity bill is enormous and complain. You have to get into the trenches and fight, because if you don't, you're going to lose everything.
Yes, run for office if that's what you want to do. Do those things. At
Yes,
least
yeah,
attempt to affect change, even though some of this is rigged.
yes,
Of course,
yeah.
folks, it really
Well,
is a lot of rigged here.
failure is quite normal. You will do these and fail, but you will create an awareness. We dine out on our successes and our wins, but when you look at your life, you have more failures than you have wins. So dine out on the wins, get into the fight. As you say, stand for office. Doesn't matter what it is. Get involved in your community and get involved speaking on these subjects. There is an enormous amount of information written down in, especially books, which are edited. The internet is not, but there's an enormous amount of stuff. Get conversant with the subject and get there in the fight, because if you don't fight, you're going to lose.
Yeah, create groups of like-minded people to help spread the word.
Yes, yes,
You can get funded through those groups and those ways. If you're actually careful and you structure it properly, you might even be able to get even government funding to help move your narrative
yes,
along if you
yeah,
do it right. So
yeah,
that actually can help too. And so I just encourage people to look at those various options. And it absolutely makes sense, Ian, because if you don't, I look at it as like a road that passes by your house.
yeah,
If you don't go out and stand up to that opposition that's coming across that road by your house, if you don't go out and actually stand up for what you stand for, then that opposition rolls right by you all the way to its objective unopposed. It's the quicker it gets there, no obstacles in the road, you just roll right by. And so that is the analogy that I think people need to understand here.
yeah,
And it
yeah,
stands, it's for everything, whether it's personal privacy, whether it's food, whether it's climate, whether it's your job, whether it's how to do something, how to construct something. It's all the same thing. It's all just how you see it and how you want to do it based on your experience, based on your expertise. And that's where it really counts. Just to wrap up here, and I really appreciate the time, if there is someone listening in, we've got various demographics that listen to our program. If they want to engage your services, whether it be as a consulting geologist or a consulting scientist, are you taking any new engagements? And with that, how can people get in touch with you?
Well, I do, and normally I donate my fees to a charity. I'm comfortable enough in life; I don't need to continue to pay more tax, and so I do. I can be easily found on web searches. The best way to find me is through my publisher, and that is Connell Court Publishing, Connor, Connell Court Publishing. They're a Brisbane publishing company, and that's the best way. I don't have a website. It is difficult every day to deal with the amount of email I get and the amount of stuff that I should read. I'm constantly having people sending me books and saying, Carl, can we have an opinion on this? Oh, by the way, by lunchtime tomorrow. I can be contacted through my publisher, Connell Court Publishing. I just recently made an arrangement with a group of farmers who want me to talk, and I'm patron of a charity here called Lifeline. It's a church charity. And so I said, well, what you've raised for me to pay me in fees, you give it to the Lifeline. I'm happy to pay for all my expenses and everything. So that's the way I operate, because I'm a member of a community, and there are many ways you can contribute to society.
Thank you for that, Ian. And of course, we have to respect your time. And so I understand why folks need to go through a process to get a hold of you. So I can certainly appreciate that. On this personal side, Ian, you've been a success story in your battle with cancer, or as they say in uncommon crowds, chronically fermenting cells. How are you holding up? Just tell us a little bit about your success and how you're holding up.
Well, it's been a bit like climate cycles. It's been up and down at present. Currently, I'm down, but for the last 2 or 3 months, it's been a bit tough, and I'm unable to take any medication at present because it just creates massive problems, and so I'm a little bit concerned at present that my guts and gut flora and gut bacteria are not behaving as they ought to, and that's got to be addressed. But I'm upright. I'm still working, still active, but it's been up and down a little bit. This is the first time for 5 years that it's been a bit like that. So we'll get over it. It's just a matter of finding out what the problem is and adjusting accordingly. My treatment is that of immunotherapy, not of chemotherapy, not of radiation therapy. And the aim was to boost my immune system, to change the way in which my gut operated, to attack the cancer cells, and to build my body. And that's been pretty successful. I've just got a slight backward step, but onwards and upwards.
Ian, thank you so much for that. Hang in there, keep up the efforts on that front, and great to hear that you've been able to defy the odds for such a long period of time compared against what you were told in the beginning. And of course, still being very productive and working a lot, as you and I both know, and keep up the recovery. Well, look, Ian, it's been great to chat. Great again to have you back on the program. We hope the audience find this discussion useful. And everybody, you just heard from Professor Plimer. Ian, thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.